Okay, welcome to the screencast. Alexander's Policy of Fusion. Again, sorry, apologies. I probably will speak quite quickly, just trying to do this while in my office. So, Alexander's Policy of Fusion fused the two cultures, Persian and Macedonian. As I talked about, many historians, particularly in the mid-20th century, wrote about this as if Alexander was some sort of modern biculturalist, even multiculturalist, trying to unite the cultures or unite the races, so to speak. It's largely being discredited now, and I will go along with that, really, from what I understand about Alexander. And I do think that although he was trying to fuse some aspects of the two cultures, it really was about Alexander's personal glory rather than any rights of humanity or anything like that. So Alexander started off by wearing Persian clothes, and this still from the movie I think sums it really well. You can see him decked out in Persian splendor, the beautiful colors, the reds and the gold, and he is surrounded by his Persians rather than his Macedonians. And so this adoption of Persian clothes and hanging out with his Persians obviously caused resentment with his Macedonians because they felt like they'd been betrayed, and Alexander was betraying Macedonia and his actual heritage, particularly his father Philip. Alexander did not go so far as to wear the Persian pants because that would have been seen as being effeminate, but he wore many other articles of Persian clothing. We come to proskynesis, the act of bowing and blowing a kiss before the king. In Persia, this was simply a social custom. It was a customary sign of respect that one did to a superior, and there's none more so superior than the great king. And you can see in this relief here, there's bowing forward from the hips and then blowing a kiss towards the king. It is simply a sign of respect, a social custom in Persia. For the Macedonians, though, that caused much hilarity because the only time any Greek would ever bow would be before a god, and definitely not before another human being. Obviously, bow down before a god in the temple, before the statue, and so on. So the Macedonians found it hilarious when the Persians started to perform proskynesis to Alexander, because to their eyes, proskynesis was the only act to do before God, and so they saw that Alexander was being worshipped as a god by the Persians, which they found both hilarious and outrageous, I'd imagine. Just fueled the resentment that they felt towards Alexander, seeing himself as the son of a Mut, not son of Zeus, or whatever he sees himself now at this point. Alexander made this worse through gasoline on the fire by insisting that his Macedonians perform proskynesis to him as well. To be fair to Alexander, he's kind of stuck because the Persians are going to perform proskynesis to him no matter what. Alexander needs the Macedonians to do it as well, because then the Persians would not see him as being the king if some of the subjects are not performing the ritual of proskynesis. So Alexander is kind of stuck there. He can't tell the Persians not to perform proskynesis because that is what they do to a king. So if he did that, then, or if he said that, then as he's saying, he's not king. And we have the famous incident where Callisthenes, Alexander's historian, he refused to perform proskynesis to Alexander, and as a result, Alexander did not give him the customary kiss. Callisthenes made a big public show of walking out the door and saying, "I go away, pour it by a kiss," which essentially marked his card. He's humiliated Alexander in front of everyone. He's made a public show of damaging Alexander's ego. We know what happens when Alexander's ego is threatened. People die. Callisthenes is a dead man, only he doesn't know it yet, or perhaps he does. We come to the conspiracy of Philotas, often called so. Whether Philotas was fully involved in the conspiracy or not, it's hard to tell. But the details are as so. Here's Philotas, son of the great Parmenio. Philotas did cause a bit of resentment. He was a bit of a braggart, a bit of arrogant show-off, and so many people didn't like him. The story goes that a man named Dimnus planned to kill Alexander. He invited his lover, Nicomachus, into the plot. Nicomachus, for some reason, perhaps not into this plotting to kill the king, he told his brother Sabellinus. Sabellinus straight away tried to get to Alexander, and he asked Philotas for an audience with Alexander, saying he has news of utmost importance. Philotas told him Alexander is too busy. Sabellinus, not to be outdone, he asked a second time the following day, and again Philotas said Alexander is still too busy. Now this causes concern because Philotas is guilty of something, of not letting Alexander know there's a plot against his life. Sabellinus eventually approaches a page, one of Alexander's close attendants, who gets an audience with Alexander. Alexander takes it seriously, sends soldiers to arrest Dimnus, Dimnus was either killed or resisting arrest, or he killed himself as the soldiers arrived. But this means there's no evidence because he can't be tortured. Alexander is deeply concerned now that there is a plot against his life. He calls the senior officers together and they vote to put Philotas on trial. They have to arrest Philotas with great care because they can't alert Parmenio. Parmenio is back in Media with 25,000 men. Parmenio gets wind that his son is in trouble. Perhaps Parmenio would march with his soldiers against Alexander. At his trial, Philotas denies he was involved in any conspiracy. He says it was a lover's tiff between these two lovers and he saw no reason to bother Alexander. Alexander's generals didn't buy it. Kratos and Hephaestion suggested torture. Philotas was thus tortured while Alexander listened behind a curtain. And when Philotas was in his extreme pain, Alexander mocked him, calling out, "You're not a man now, Philotas." And Philotas was stoned or speared to death in the Macedonian fashion. Now, Philotas was put to death, but there are reasons behind it. He was arrogant, he was boastful, especially to his mistress Antigone. After making love, his pillow talk was about how great he was and how great his father was, not Alexander. In fact, Philotas would go far to say that Alexander's victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela were really down to Parmenio and Philotas rather than Alexander himself. Philotas also loved the Persian luxury, a tasteless display of wealth which caused resentment. People didn't like the son of the great Parmenio, and so many were eager to see him brought down, which is exactly what happened. But Alexander is now paranoid, I'd say, and paranoid and suspicious. So he fears there's a plot around him. He executes his cousin, Alexander of Lyncestis. You remember him? He was the first to acclaim Alexander as king when Philip was assassinated, because chance of Alexander of Lyncestis become the focus of the plot. So he's done away with. Alexander is now seeing really increased reaction by the Macedonians of resentment to his satrap policy, putting Persians in charge, to Alexander wearing Persian clothes and insisting they perform proskynesis. He had to do away with that after the Callistus incident, because it was clear the Macedonians were not going to perform proskynesis, so Alexander abandoned the idea of making the Macedonians do it. So there's a resentment against Alexander, there's real discontent, but what's Alexander going to do with Parmenio? He's in Media, he's got 25,000 men. We could have a civil war once he hears about his son's being executed. Parmenio could march on Alexander with his men, who are very loyal to Parmenio. That's not to say they're not loyal to Alexander, though, so it's a moot point. What to do with Parmenio? We watched the movie, and Parmenio was assassinated. Alexander sent assassins, and they killed Parmenio in Media. Okay, we could come to the murder of Clytus, which we went through. Now, this man named Clytus, here he is here. His sister actually breastfed Alexander, the customary practice of having a wet nurse. Obviously, Olympus is far too busy to breastfeed her son. Clytus was a bit older than Alexander. He was a trusted general under Philip, and he had saved Alexander's life at Granicus when that Persian was about to chop Alexander's beautiful head off. Clytus swooped in and cut off the Persian's arm. When killed, Philotas's duties, his responsibilities are carved up into two. Part of it went to Hephaestion and part of it went to Clytus. So Clytus is well connected to Alexander as a trusted man and a well-liked man, I would say. Problem was the Macedonians were having a drinking party. And at this point, Alexander decided it was wise to start mocking some of his commanders who had been defeated by the Afghani tribesmen. And he was having quite good fun doing this, and a song was composed and sung about how hopeless the commanders were because they lost. Alexander wasn't there. Clytus was enraged. He bellowed at Alexander, "Who do you think you are, boy, to be saying these things about your own army? What's more, what's a son of a mun stuff? What's a son of a god stuff? Look at you in your Persian clothes, hanging out with Persians, trying to get us to perform proskynesis. Look what you did to Philotas, look what you did to Parmenio." Clytus brings it all up. Okay, they're all drunk, and they're enraged and they're emotional. Clytus brings it all up. Alexander's absolutely furious. He tries to get to Clytus. He calls for his bodyguards to arrest Clytus. The bodyguards say, "No, I'm not going to do that." Alexander thinks there's a massive conspiracy against his life. He calls for the trumpeter to sound the alarm. The trumpeter says, "No, I'm not going to do that." Alexander's now convinced they're all out to kill him. He reaches for a sword. One of his bodyguards has removed his sword. Probably he doesn't hurt himself when he's drunk. Alexander is now hyper paranoid, convinced he's about to be assassinated, and he sees enemies everywhere. But Clytus's friends bundle Clytus out of the room and try to calm Alexander down. Unfortunately for Clytus, he bursts back in because he's got one last retort to make, and he sort of mocks Alexander with a line from a play that all the glory goes to the kings, when actually it's everyone else who does the hard work. Alexander, drunk, emotional, angry, hypersensitive, seizes a spear and plunges into Clytus's belly, killing him instantly, and Clytus collapses. So there we go. That's the story of today. Alexander's done away with a few more friends. Ko kakite.